Hello and welcome to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and this evening I will be doing a review for My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. This is a literary fiction novel, to change it up a bit, and it came out very recently in the month of March, and I was very excited, I guess, to read this. Excited is not quite the right word, but I felt I really needed to read this novel, and I can already tell you I very much enjoyed it. Though again, I'm not sure enjoy is the right word, but I did give it 4 stars on Goodreads. I think it's technically a bit more of a 4.5 stars, but yeah, 4 stars on Goodreads. Now, what is this book about, beyond being literary fiction? This is the story of Vanessa Y, the main character's relationship with her teacher in boarding school. That's like the very basic premise. It looks at her life, right? It's a dual timeline. She's, on the one hand, in 2017, 32, telling the story of her life and this relationship, which has marked her very significantly. And the other part of the story is her at 15 years old, meeting this teacher who is 42 at the time. I think he's 27 years older than her, meeting him in boarding school, falling in love with him, and having a relationship which does, yes, include sex. And, well, you see how that unfolds. Why did I want to read this? So this is a pretty important disclaimer I'm going to put right at the beginning of this video. 75 to 80% of the way I rated and related to this novel is quite simply because I lived through this. I experienced a very similar situation, a very similar relationship. I was in fact even younger than Vanessa when it started, and it ended around the time I turned 20 years old. So this is very, very personal for me. I read this thinking, how does this compare to my own lived experience? And this is the closest I've yet come to reading about my own life, or a big part of my own life story written by another person in a work of fiction. So it was a very particular experience for me reading this. That's why I said I'm not sure enjoying is the right word. I enjoyed it because it was cathartic in a way, but it was also very uncomfortable. And at times I laughed also because I could recognize different elements. I was like, yeah, that was so me. That was so me. Yes, I've had the exact same arguments, the exact same conversations. So that was very weird and interesting at the same time. So I am not coming into this unbiased in a way. I'm coming into this with a very specific personal background attached. Though I did rate the writing, I did rate the characters. I'm going to talk about those things, but a lot of what I got out of this was directly linked to whether or not I could see myself in Vanessa Y, in the situation she was in, if I could compare my own relationship to the relationship described in this book. So my point is, this review is going to be a bit different. And the way I review this novel is a bit different, is tainted in a way by very direct personal experience. I'll talk about the writing. This was decently written. Well written, I would say. Actually, no, it was well written. This is the debut novel by this author. Now, she says that this is not an autobiographical novel. It is fiction, though it is informed by her own experiences with older men when she was a teenager / young adult. And there are clear parallels, I guess, to something like Lolita, though there are clear differences as well. And the author has read Lolita and was influenced by that, and she even dedicates the novel to all the Dolores Hayes and Vanessa Ys of the world. So me, I guess, this is dedicated to me in a way. Weird. It's nothing mind-blowing either. So this book was apparently her PhD thesis in creative writing, I guess. There were some interesting descriptions of Vanessa's inner life, mostly because this is written in first-person point of view, and it's told solely from the point of view of the one character, Vanessa Y. So you have a direct access to her inner life, her inner thoughts. And there's some interesting developments in there. It's a very introspective way of writing, I guess you could say. I mean, it's obviously not on the level of Vladimir Nabokov. but I didn't expect it to be. So it's not actual criticism. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying that even though it has been compared to Lolita, in it being Lolita told from the point of view of Lolita, it's not on the level of Lolita writing-wise, is my point. But it doesn't have to be either. So I mentioned already that it's a dual timeline. Half the book, I mean, it's not split half and half. Like, it's one chapter in 2000, I think, 2001, one chapter in 2017, and it alternates that way all throughout the book. 2017, Vanessa Y is 32 years old. Her life is sort of in shambles. I mean, that might be a bit mean, but she abandoned her literary studies. She's working at a hotel. Not that there's anything wrong or demeaning about that, mind you. But you can tell that that's not what she wanted out of her life initially. She's just broken up with a boyfriend. She's seeing a therapist because her dad died. And she's still in contact with this teacher she had a relationship with throughout her teenage and early adult years. And the story starts off with her realizing or learning that another student from her previous boarding school has come forward with sexual misconduct, sexual assault allegations towards this teacher. And so she has to re-examine her relationship with the teacher, called Jacob Strain. Obviously, this is very uncomfortable for her because she does not see herself as a victim. This is the leitmotif of the novel, is that Vanessa does not consider herself a victim of sexual abuse. She does not feel like she fits in the Me Too movement because that's going full swing by the time she's 32, 2017. She doesn't recognize the picture this other young woman called Taylor Birch is painting of Jacob Strain. She doesn't want to be a part of these allegations. She doesn't want to come forward with her story. She does not recognize herself in the label of survivor or victim. But on the other hand, her life isn't going that great, and she's recollecting dodgy bits of her relationship with Jacob Strain. So that's the whole point of that part of the narrative. I'm basically in Vanessa Y's position. I'm not here to start a debate or shock anyone, but I'm in this in-between, this grey area where I do not consider myself a victim of rape or of sexual assault or child abuse or whatever you want to call it. But at the same time, I do recognize there were issues with this relationship. It was not ethical, it was on a certain level emotionally manipulative, and I am, as an adult woman now, realizing that I might need to address some of these things. But yes, like I said, the details of my own experience are even more damning, if you want, than in Vanessa's case. Anyway, so I'm in Vanessa's position, basically. I full-heartedly support the Me Too movement and that whole thing as a feminist. I don't actually consider myself a part of it, though, and I do not know how I would react if, in my case, someone came forward with accusations towards this teacher I had a relationship with, because yes, he's still alive, as far as I know. He's retired, and as far as I know, I'm the only minor he had a relationship with. That's a major difference between my story and Vanessa's story. In Vanessa's case, this young woman, Taylor Birch, is coming forward, and then other young women start manifesting themselves. So she has to reckon with all of that. And you have that other timeline, which picks up from the moment she attends her second year at this prestigious boarding school. I mean, she has a scholarship to go to because she comes from a working class background, and this is very much a school meant for, like, upper class students. It's the second year that she's very isolated because she broke up with her best friend from the previous year, so she's alone. She's intellectually a bit more advanced, I guess, than her peers, though it's not that obvious, I think. I mean, I say that, but at the same time, she is, like, in advanced placements for several different classes, so yeah, the intellectual potential is definitely there. I mean, she wouldn't have a scholarship otherwise, I guess. But so she's isolated, she has a single room in her dorm, and so she meets this teacher, Jacob Strain, who's very intense, very passionate about his subject, which is English literature, and they bond over that. And so all of those chapters tell that story as she's experiencing it from the age of 15 up until about the age of 22. And like I said, this kind of serves as a parallel, but a reverse parallel to Lolita. What else, right? Because instead of having just the point of view of Humbert Humbert, the predator, it is Vanessa's point of view, the victim. It's her story, it's her voice, it's her recollections, her narration, which is also perhaps a little bit unreliable, but I'll get back to that. So I thought that was interesting. It's a good counterweight to Lolita, even though, like I said, they are different stories too. I will say, overall, the characterization is pretty solid in this novel. I mean, the story relies entirely on the interaction of these two characters, so that would make sense, but it could have flopped, and it didn't. Vanessa Y, from the moment she's 15 years old, is a solitary young teen/woman, whichever you prefer. She's very interested in literature. She writes poetry. She's in advanced placement literature and a couple other advanced placement classes as well. She's described as a dark romantic, but it's hard to parse out what's really her and what's been suggested by Jacob Strain. That's the running theme in there. Like, she's not always sure of her own identity because it becomes so entangled with the image of herself she's fed by Jacob. So that gets a bit complicated. But overall, I think, you could say she's intellectually precocious a bit. She definitely doesn't make friends easily. Like I said, she broke up with this female friend, and she was very strongly attached to that one female friend. So I guess that might suggest that she loves or she forms attachments very strongly, but very, very selectively, which is something I can entirely relate to. But so that goes belly up, and so she's alone, and that's also a running thing. Her mum's always like telling her, you got to make friends, you got to go out there and socialize and make friends, but she doesn't really want to either, and she doesn't seem to suffer that much from it. So I'm gathering that she is a solitary person by nature. There's also a current of melancholia running inside of her, I'd say. And this is alluded to directly a couple of times in the book. But most of the time it's suggested to her by Jacob Strain, saying she's a dark romantic like him, and there's a current of almost depression in her. But I do think she genuinely felt it herself on her own. She mentions at one point that she has this memory of being a kid and coming home from school with a report card that said, oh, she's 8 going on 30, suggesting, like I said, a genuine intellectual precociousness, I guess. A fairly high level of maturity for her age, at least, again, on the intellectual level, which, like I said, is something I related to very strongly. I'd say I was even more isolated. I mean, I genuinely had social anxiety, so that probably doesn't help. I didn't make friends easily. I was definitely intellectually precocious. That's what I've been told anyway all my life by the people around me, the adults around me, and the proof is in the pudding, I guess, because I had a hard time relating to people my own age. And I had depression also, so the feelings of melancholia, yes, 100%, even more than her, I would say. One thing I do find interesting, but also a bit confusing, is that even as she's telling the story from the point of view of a 15-year-old and a 16, 17, 18, etc. year old, there's a kind of contradiction to her narrative, which I think probably just expresses this feeling of confusion that she felt she did love Strain and she was consenting. At some time she's feeling uncomfortable and not happy with the situation, which in and of itself, I guess, would make sense to the vast majority of people. I don't know, I was a wee bit bugged sometimes by this dilly-dallying around between contradicting positions, maybe because I'm just a person who doesn't like contradiction within oneself. I feel that at the same age, I was more convinced of some things, at least with regards to my relationship with the teacher. So I was less doubtful. The doubts have cropped up, honestly, in the last couple of years, and I'm 27. Not back then when I was around her age. I don't think it's necessarily a problem in the writing or anything. It's just something that bothered me. But again, I'm biased here. I'm going to repeat that a lot. I'm very biased here. So again, take it with a grain of salt. And then you have, of course, Jacob Strain. Now, since this is kind of a reverse Lolita parallel, you don't really ever know Jacob Strain, just like you don't ever really know Lolita in Lolita, right? But briefly, you can definitely tell that Jacob Strain is a 42-year-old man, passionate about English literature. I mean, you can think he was a creep, a pervert, an abuser, but you cannot deny that he loved the subject of English literature and really communicated that in his classroom, because she's always describing him as either being super enthusiastic when a student comes up with an interesting idea, or he gets really aggressive and like pissy when someone says something he deems to be incredibly stupid. He really comes down on them, like almost scary. And there's definitely something charismatic about him. Maybe, or maybe not. It's hard to tell actually. She certainly falls under his spell in a way, but most students don't seem to really care that much. She never describes him as attractive or beautiful or hot though. And that's very interesting. That's an interesting difference with Lolita. Because in Lolita, Humbert describes himself as attractive. Now you could say, well, yeah, he's obviously going to paint himself in a good light. But like other people remark upon this, that he looks like a movie star. And even Lolita says that he looks like a movie star because she's got all these posters of actors, etc. Strain is never described as handsome or attractive, but she comes to associate his figure, his body, obviously with a certain degree of comfort when he hugs her, etc. Though she does express revulsion at his body at some point when they have sex, which was also interesting because that's not something I could relate to actually. When I was in love with a teacher, like today, now, I think the guy's ugly as hell. But at the time when I was a teenager, I fell madly in love. And you know what they say, love makes you blind. And I can confirm that 1000%. So yeah, and I was never disgusted by the body and the bodily things, at least not when it got serious. So I couldn't really relate to that particular bit. Apart from that, another interesting thing I found with Jacob Strain is that there are definite currents of insecurity and immaturity, I would say, even when he interacts with Vanessa in the relationship. Things that, ooze out through the cracks. He gets jealous. He gets really controlling and, I guess, a bit emotionally abusive, to be honest. And he almost appears like a teenager himself in the insecurity. And that's something I definitely experienced with my own teacher. Like, the guy was a grown-ass adult. And at times, the way he reacted, I was like, dude, you're so freaking immature. So that made me laugh, actually, because I was like, yeah, I experienced that, most definitely. Sometimes you'd be surprised at the role reversals. Like, you would think, yes, the teenager, even perhaps the young adult, is immature when they're emotionally manipulated. Sure, that's valid. But you'd be surprised sometimes how the older man can be himself very childish and immature. Just saying. There is obviously a current of manipulation, I'm not going to lie. And I can now, as an adult, recognize the manipulation involved with my own relationship. One difference, though, and that really disgusted me outright in the book, Jacob Strain does a couple of times exhibit weird penchants in the bedroom. He asks Vanessa to do a couple of things, say a couple of things that entail, the daddy trope, which is something that profoundly disgusts me, has always profoundly disgusted me, and which was never a thing in my relationship, thank the friggin' gods. But the whole daddy thing, pseudo-incest bullshit, which you also have in Lolita, I don't get that. I find that really, really freaking creepy. So you do have to ask yourself with Jacob Strain, like, where does that come from, mate? Like, he does emphasize Vanessa's maturity and he concentrates on her womanhood. He's not obsessed with her childishness the way Humbert does in Lolita. Like, Humbert explains pretty explicitly that he's interested in 9 to 12, 13, perhaps 14 years old. And he's really interested by that transition between childhood and, in his case, womanhood. Here, Strain does seem more focused on the emerging womanhood, adulthood of Vanessa, and, they do continue their relationship into her young adult years. I'm not convinced that pedophilia fits here, is kind of what I'm trying to say. Except for those two little elements of the daddy trope, I'm just not going to say any more than that. That made it more obviously squicky to me, is my point. And finally, I'm going to quickly mention a secondary character, because I think his addition was interesting and pretty relevant to the story and also to my own experience once again, is Vanessa's university professor called Henry Plow, again, an English lit professor. He is much younger. He's still older than her. He's like in his mid-30s and she's in her early 20s. And she does realize that he's very much interested in her, and something which is very much not to his credit, he's already married and he married a former student. But he does seem kinder than Strain. He's less darkly intense. He seems to care in a much more positive way about Vanessa, and he's horrified when he learns about Vanessa's relationship with Jacob Strain when she was 15, then 16, etc. But he never dares make the first move. Like, he controls himself. He keeps himself in check. He never touches her. She actually wants him to, like, initiate. She doesn't know how to initiate things herself, probably because she never really truly initiated things herself back when she was 15. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, I've seen differing opinions on Goodreads and discussions about this novel. No, he's just as much of a creep as Strain. No, he's more of a good guy figure. I'm more in the camp of he's in a better guy figure. Maybe good, I mean, good is a bit abstract in this context. I'm not really sure because it never goes anywhere, but he does keep in contact with her. He asks about her, like, how is she doing? Is she pursuing a postgraduate degree? So there does seem to be genuine benevolence towards her on his part. And I guess this made me think of the relationship I had which followed my relationship with the teacher, which was a good thing, but at the same time it made me a bit uncomfortable because I started thinking about the motivations behind my second relationship. So complicated feelings all around is my point, but I thought it was an interesting addition because it also helps to explore Vanessa's relationship with Strain, what she has inherited in terms of emotional maturity or emotional trauma, etc. And I'll conclude this section on a more criticizing note, I guess. Like I said, the characterization overall is very good. I do have a slight quibble, though, with Vanessa's inner life. Because, I mean, this is presented as a young woman who is very interested in literature, has a rich, dark, inner emotional life. She writes poetry. She wants to read all the books that Strain gives her. And of course, he gives her Lolita to read. But the thing is, her identity quickly becomes subsumed in her relationship with Strain. And it really becomes all about that. And her interests in literature and whatever else gets put to the side. I mean, you do get to learn about the fact that she loves the family dog. And she talks about her parents. Now, again, to most people, I assume this is not a problem because it would just be proof that, oh, look, he abuses so much that she built her entire identity around him. She lost her own sense of self, etc., etc., etc. But remember, I'm a biased reader going into this. I was not like that, or at least definitely not to the same degree. Like, to say I was obsessed with my relationship is accurate, is completely 100% fair. I'm the first one to say that. Being in love is like being on cocaine. But even when I was 14, 15, 16, I had my own passions. I had my own interests. A lot of interests and passions I still have to this day. And sure, I got interested in some things that the teacher introduced me to. But the teacher also had a relationship with me because we shared some interests in literature and spirituality, in science, etc. Also, funny little note, I do find it interesting that in most of these types of books, because I have read other books in the same genre, it's always an English literature professor, or teacher, I mean. I'm assuming it's because it gives you a nifty device to, you know, plug in literary references, very romantic poetry, etc., etc. But guess what? It's not just the literature teachers. It's not. In my case, the teacher was a science and maths teacher. But so yeah, I guess I would have enjoyed seeing Vanessa's interests more fully fleshed out and developed to just, you know, point to what made her attracted to Strain in the first place. It is a bit more developed when she goes to uni to study English literature. But I guess, I don't know, I thought something was missing a bit. Since this is literary fiction, there's no world building section, right? We're not in speculative literature, so there's no need for that. So I'll jump straight into the themes. First is probably the most obvious one, and the most contentious, probably consent. Very simply, consent, or more specifically perhaps informed consent. Because in the novel, Vanessa is struggling whilst she's a teenager, and of course when she's an older woman, with whether or not she truly consented to this relationship. For 90% of the book, she comes down on the side of, yes, I wanted this. But then you see some cracks, like, I had to want this, or he initiated, but I responded positively. And he always asked me what I wanted to do, and I said yes, but at the same time she realizes that he asked her as he was doing the things. So it's a bit of a wobbly line there, right? I think it was an interesting discussion. Consent versus informed consent. Maybe that when you're 15 or 16 or whatever, you can in fact consent to sex or relationship. I guess sex is the thing that people focus the most on, let's be real here. But it's not informed consent because you lack a certain degree of at least emotional maturity, if not physical maturity or intellectual maturity, because I think you can have those things. But it's the emotional maturity part. And of course, there's the power imbalance. In this specific case, you know, a teacher, a person who's supposed to guide younger people. So there's an abuse of power, if nothing else. Consent itself is probably not enough, or at least it's not enough if you're not an adult, right? But I think this can apply to adults as well, though. Because, like, alcohol. You say you can't consent under alcohol, but maybe the more relevant term would be you can't consent with all the information at hand under alcohol because your brain's going under the booze, right? You can still say, yes, I want to have sex, even though I'm drunk. But then you might regret it the next day. So it's not informed consent. It's not direct discussion, but you could obviously start a discussion based on this book about the age of consent, the usefulness of age of consent laws. Do they really cover what needs to be covered? Do they actually protect young people? Are they useless? Are they absolutely necessary? How do you even define age of consent? How do you place it? That's talked about directly in the book. Like she says, does that make sense that there's a magical line you cross when you turn 18? Before 18, you're incapable of consenting to sex, and then bam, you turn 18 and you can suddenly consent to anything you want? Or call BDSM if you want? It's a bit weird. And I kind of have to agree with that. I'm not against age of consent, by the way, not by any means. But there is a discussion to be had there, even though it might make a lot of people uncomfortable. I think it's a worthwhile discussion. And linked to that, obviously, is the notion of maturity. A lot of people think that, you know, you're still a child when you're 18. I think that's a bit absurd, personally. I mean, we invented the concept of adolescence for a reason. Might as well use it. Is kind of my point. Because, you know, there's that disconnect between biological maturity and social psychological maturity. So let's make use of adolescence and not just extend childhood ad nauseum. I don't think that makes much sense, personally. Because, I mean, you know, even when she's 32 years old, is she that psychologically or emotionally mature? She describes, you know, a string of one-night stands, and dodgy one-night stands, I might add, with strange men, older men who just use her. I mean, she did have a boyfriend, but the boyfriend basically dumped her because he was pissed that she didn't consider herself a victim of abuse, which I think is a bit messed up, honestly. Like, meet your girlfriend where she's at, mate. Like, you can't just force a psychological narrative onto someone. It's pointless. It doesn't work. Trust me. But so, I mean, you do see the aftermath of that relationship on her own psyche. So you could argue, I mean, she's 32 years old now, but is she really that much more emotionally mature than when she was 15 or 20? Some people might say, yes, it's very clear and apparent. I'm not so sure, to be honest. You do feel the difference in tone in the writing between adult Vanessa and young adult Vanessa, and it's kind of a fine line, in my opinion. The second theme, I think, is a multifaceted one. It's a mosaic that addresses memory, trauma, and maybe that's not so much a theme as like a writing device, unreliable narration / recollection, which I found interesting because that parallels Lolita a bit. Memory and trauma, obviously, because she's remembering this relationship as an adult, as a 32-year-old, but also thinking about the relationship as she's living through it and contradicting herself when she talks about what she's feeling, the strain, feeling about the relationship, about herself. But her recollecting as an adult was interesting because I could just see so much of myself in that. I'm younger than her. So that was interesting to read about, to see the knots she's tying herself into to perhaps justify certain things, to make sense of others. Because memory is a fickle bitch. And I'm realizing this, I'm not that old, and I don't remember certain things as well as I'd want to, I guess. Especially with regards to this particular subject. I remember some things, I don't remember others. And now I have a lot of questions in my mind, and I don't know how to answer them because I don't know who to ask. And it's very annoying and frustrating, let me tell you. And trauma, maybe. Again, Vanessa doesn't consider herself a victim of rape, a victim of sexual abuse, very much like I don't consider myself a victim of rape or sexual abuse. But trauma can result from other things as well. Emotional abuse, emotional manipulation. In Vanessa's case, it's a bit obvious she's suffering from some kind of trauma because her life is a bit of a mess and she's still deeply enmeshed in this relationship with Strain. She still craves his attention, his presence. I mean, there's scenes in there where she's masturbating while he recounts moments they shared together when she was 15. That's different, let's say. I'm just gonna leave that. That's different. So clearly she has unresolved issues. Now, one thing I didn't like about the book, because once again, I just couldn't relate to it. Most people will say that I didn't have a problem with that, it makes sense. And good for you, more power to you, but I'm coming from a very different place. I don't really do trigger warnings, but you should know that this book has graphic sex descriptions. I don't think they're that bad, but again, I'm coming from a very different place than I'm guessing the majority of readers, so a lot of people are probably going to be uncomfortable with that given the age of Vanessa at the time of those scenes. Not that graphic either. I've read way more explicit stuff than this, but they are descriptive. And a few times she describes when they're having sex what amounts to, what do you call it, depersonalization or disembodiment. She gets a bit disembodied, which reads to me as a cliched description of rape disembodiment, something that would cause PTSD or even outright PTSD when she has sex with him when she's older. Like, she completely gets out of her body and thinks about the most random things, bread rising. And I was like, where the hell does that come from? It didn't make any sense to me. A lot of people will say, well, yeah, she was raped. She was 15. It makes perfect sense. But hold on a minute. I did not go through that personally. At the time, in any case, I didn't feel I was being violated physically. I did not go into a weird happy sphere. I didn't get disembodied. I was very much in my body and I was not repulsed. So I guess my point is you can still explore the themes of manipulation, abuse, whether it be sexual, emotional, or both, the blurred lines of consent, without going the route of what I felt was very cliched, very forced rape narratives. I know it sounds weird, but I didn't think it was necessary because it felt fake. I know that the author started writing this when she was herself quite young. She wrote this over like a decade. And later in the process of writing this book, she did research into trauma theory and she read accounts from rape survivors, etc. And it feels a bit like she tried too hard to fit that neatly into there, onto an already pre-existing story. That might not be the case though, I mean, I don't know, but that's how it felt to me. I couldn't really buy it. And I say this also because there is a scene where she has sex with Trainer, and she's much older, she's like in her early 20s. And she has this disembodiment experience. But there it made perfect sense. It was very different from the other scenes when she was a lot younger. The circumstances were quite different. And that felt perfectly organic and seamless. I bought that scene completely. I could feel the trauma and I could almost relate to it. Whereas the scenes when she's a teenager and she's picturing bread rising, there's literally no context for that. Why would she picture that? Like, there's no reference to her baking bread with her mum and that being her happy place or anything. It just felt so random. And contrast that also to scenes where she's having sex with him and she's enjoying herself. It was weird, it was jarring. It didn't feel cohesive, I guess. And like I said, I know for a fact that you don't even need that to make the story work, to make the points about abuse, about trauma work. So my point is, you don't have to make the sex overtly creepy, problematic, violent. It's not that it's violent. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that she's pushed against the wall and just taken, right? And that's not it. But there are a couple of problematic scenes, which in any other context wouldn't bother me. In this particular context, it does. I just didn't think it was necessary, especially because I didn't think it worked in the narrative as it is written. And finally, and this is a theme that I find very personally important, is the right to have your own voice and to have your own story put into your own words. By that, I mean that Vanessa is trying to come to terms with a very complicated part of her life story. A bit like me, though my life story is not reduced to that relationship the way hers is, I feel, and I have other stuff to bug me, so yay me. Anyway, it's something very difficult to think about because there's literally no one you can talk to about it apart from a shrink. Because in my experience, you have two types of reactions with these narratives. I will be generalizing a bit, but basically you either have creeps who will latch on to these kinds of stories, to my kind of story, to justify bad behavior, unethical behavior, or you have the very loud majority which will tell you, shut up, you don't know what you're talking about, you were raped, you were a victim of child abuse, you don't know what you're talking about, you have Stockholm Syndrome, you'll realize you're wrong, give it 10 years, something to that general effect. And this is exactly what happens in the book. Now, like I said, a very big difference between Vanessa's story and my story is that, as far as I know, no one else has come forward about the teacher I dated. I don't like using that word, but fuck it. In Vanessa's case, you have this young woman called Taylor Birch coming forward, and then a few other young women come forward as well. The catch, though, is that they've only been touched on the knee, on the shoulder. In the case of Taylor Birch, Strain basically just patted her on the knee, and that really freaks her out, so she goes to the school director and tells everything. And since there's already a record of him having a relationship with Vanessa, because his relationship with her caused her to be expelled from the school, which is also pretty crappy given that she comes from a working class background, and this school was a really important opportunity for her to go to very good universities, get scholarships, and that just gets wiped away. So there's already that prior record for Strain, and now years later this is coming back, and so there's a crap ton of pressure put on him to leave the school, and there's an investigation going on, etc. But Vanessa feels a bit weird about the whole thing because she gets into this huge argument with Taylor Birch because she meets up with her. Because Taylor Birch seeks her out to say, join us to put Strain behind bars and bring him to justice. And Vanessa's like, the hell are you talking about? I don't want to do that. I have nothing to do with you people. I don't think I was a victim of anything. But at the same time, Vanessa's like, why are you even complaining? I actually had sex with a guy. I bore the brunt of him, is the way she puts it. I had to put up with the emotional pain of being separated from him when I was kicked out of the school. I had to be kicked out of the school. I had this intense sexual relationship with him. He barely touched you on the knee. Like, what's your problem? She doesn't understand at all that these women could be coming forward for something so minor in her eyes. And so when I'm reading this, on the one hand, I'm like 100% behind Vanessa. I'm like, if anyone's going to complain about the guy, it should be you because you actually had the relationship, right? At the same time, the feminist in me is like, well, I mean, I can understand being uncomfortable with having your knee touched or your shoulders touched, though I might be a feminist, but I also have my own opinions. And I do think putting a bit of perspective on inappropriate conduct is important. I'm not saying women should be touched when they don't want to, like, even on the knee, it's not on. I'm just saying it's not on the same level as, well, rape. So that whole thing was interesting. And, I mean, when Taylor Birch realizes that Vanessa's, like, still, in a way, in love with Strain, that's never really made clear that she still actually loves him. Strain does tell her he loves her several times. Anyway, so Taylor Birch realizes that it's not going to go anywhere, and she's disgusted by Vanessa, like, what the hell is wrong with you? You were raped, like, you're in such denial. I love that confrontation. I was like, that would be so me in that situation, though, I mean, honestly. And then one thing I hated is that a journalist comes around, but I mean like a greedy, opportunistic journalist. He sends an email to Vanessa, but then even kind of harasses her, like calls her all the time, says, I want to use your story in the attack piece I'm going to do and write up on Strain. I found your blog, because she kept a blog as a teenager. I found your blog where you wrote about him. I'm going to use it. And she's like, do you even have permission to do that? It doesn't matter because it was in the public domain. And so Vanessa tries to delete it. And the journalist is such a bitch. It's one thing to bring someone to justice, but exploiting someone's vulnerable position, questioning of her own life experiences like that is disgusting. If someone dared do that to me, put a certain narrative on my own experience, I would rage so hard. Like, go F yourself so hard. Leave me the hell alone. You don't know me. You don't know my story. Sod off. But so my point is, you have all these women trying to tell Vanessa what it is she's actually feeling. The problem with big movements that gather a lot of momentum pretty quickly is that you run the risk of only allowing a certain kind of narrative. And that's the point of this book. Some of us live in the grey areas, which is beautifully illustrated by this grey cover. We live in the grey areas. We don't neatly, cleanly fit into something like the Me Too movement or the movement to elevate victims' voices or the voices of women who have suffered from some complicated crap, basically. Vanessa feels deeply alienated from the Me Too movement and from all these women trying to tell her what she experienced, what it is that she's feeling, what it is that she is, trying to define her identity as a victim, as a survivor, and as a woman. And that's wrong in a way, because you can't just say, we're going to listen to women, but then only listen to women whose narrative fits what we want it to be. Imposing a cookie-cutter narrative on people, on women, more specifically on people in general, doesn't actually help. In fact, it can hurt, it can harm, especially if said people, said women, are struggling with very difficult, complicated emotions, complex memories, potential trauma, but trauma that might not just neatly fit into the pre-approved trauma everyone's talking about. And I felt that very deeply. Like, believe me, I was told growing up from the time I started that relationship that I suffered from Stockholm syndrome, which for one thing is patently absurd because Stockholm syndrome applies to a very specific kind of situation. So that's one thing that just annoyed the crap out of me. And just telling me, you were raped, you were a child, you were abused, but you're just gonna make me dig my heels in deeper. And that's exactly what Vanessa does. It doesn't help people like us. It just makes us support the abuser, or the person that's supposed to be the abuser, even more. I defended my teacher until I was 20 years old. Now, my saving grace, which doesn't happen for Vanessa, is I fell out of love with the teacher. From one day to the next, I felt nothing for the guy. I feel nothing for the guy today, basically. He could drop dead, I wouldn't much care, I don't think. That's also a big difference. I don't think she ever truly falls out of love or out of infatuation or obsession, whatever you want to call it. I don't really defend him either. I still have my own words and my own opinion about my own experience, and I'm trying to figure shit out with that. I don't accept other people imposing a preconceived narrative onto that. I find it, quite frankly, a bit offensive. I understand, though, that most of the time, like 99% of the time, it does come from a largely well-meaning place. I do acknowledge that. I realize that. I understand that. But it got really tiring after like 10 years of that, you know? So I really understood Vanessa's grief with just that whole thing that falls on top of her, trying to tell her that she's a rape victim, that she's a survivor, and she just feels so weirded out by those words, like they don't fit her. And I will say, I think the ending of this book will probably frustrate a lot of people, because I know how a lot of people think about these types of stories. And I'm not saying you're wrong. I mean, I would say you're actually probably right to a large extent. Even I recognize that the relationship I lived through was not ethical, was wrong in a way, was effed up. But just saying the guy was a monster and I'm a poor little rape survivor, it's not quite right either. And we exist. People like me or Vanessa, we exist. And we should have the opportunity to speak about our experiences, if we want to, without being slammed with preconceived notions and pre-approved narratives, is my point. Especially if all those people, you know, they say they want to help women or victims or whatever, they want to help us heal, well then let us do that on our own terms. As you can imagine, I wrote a crap ton of quotes from this book in my quote notebook. Don't worry, I'm not going to read everything because we're going to be here until tomorrow if I do that, so I'm going to select the most relevant. If there's one thing you take away from this class, it should be that the world is made of endlessly intersecting stories, each one valid and true. Because even if I sometimes use the word abuse to describe certain things that were done to me, in someone else's mouth the word turns ugly and absolute. It swallows up everything that happened. It swallows me and all the times I wanted it, begged for it. Like the laws that flatten all the sex I had with Strain before I turned 18 into legal rape. Are we supposed to believe that birthday is magic? Sometimes it feels like that's all I'm doing every time I reach out, trying to haunt, to drag him back in time, asking him to tell me again what happened. Make me understand it once and for all, because I'm still stuck here. I can't move on. I lift my face so my mouth almost touches his neck, and I feel him swallow once, twice. It's how he swallows, like he's pushing something down within him, that gives me the courage to press my lips against his skin. It's only a half kiss, but he shudders from it, and the feel of that makes me swell like a wave. In the moment, it's enough to make me feel like I've won, But once I'm settled at my desk, the pit in my stomach takes root and blooms into humiliation. Discarded again at the first opportunity, tossed aside like trash. The same thing he did when I was 22, when I was 16. It's a truth so blatant and bitter, not even I can sweeten it into something easier to swallow. Driven toward him, I was the kind of girl that isn't supposed to exist. One eager to hurl herself into the path of a pedophile. But no, that word isn't right. Never has been. It's a cop-out. A lie in the way it's wrong to call me a victim and nothing more. He was never so simple, neither was I. Is it really impossible to imagine that I might emerge from this worldly and wise? A girl with a story to tell? Someday when people ask me, who was your first lover? The truth will set me apart. He made me see myself in a way a boy my own age never would. No one can convince me that I would have been better off if I'd been like the other girls at school, giving blowjobs and handjobs, all that endless labour, before being deemed a slut and thrown away. Not that I've been raped. Not raped. Strain hurt me sometimes, but never like that. Though I could claim he raped me and I'm sure I'd be believed. I could participate in this movement of women upon women lining the walls with every bad thing that's ever happened to them, but I'm not going to lie to fit in. I'm not going to call myself a victim. Women like Taylor find comfort in that label, and that's great for them. But I'm the one he called when he was on the brink. He said it himself. With me, it was different. He loved me. And isn't that what consent is? Always being asked what you want? Did I want him to kiss me? Did I want him to touch me? Did I want him to fuck me? Slowly guided into the fire. Why is everyone so scared to admit how good that can feel? Trust me, I know how hard this is. Janine lowers her voice. I'm a survivor too. That word, with its cloying empathy, that patronizing, flattening word that makes my whole body cringe no matter the context, it pushes too far. I hope he's terrified, even if only for a moment. I love him, but when I think of that photo of him accepting the award in New York, the Association of New England Boarding Schools recognizing Jacob Strain as a Distinguished Teacher of the Year, I want to hurt him. I've become an expert of the age gap trope, consuming books, films, anything featuring a romance between an adult and legal child. I search endlessly for myself, but never find anything truly accurate. Girls in those stories are always victims, and I am not. I open my mouth, the word because poised to come out. Because whatever happened to you couldn't have been so bad. Because it's ridiculous for you to demand so much when I'm the one who bore the brunt of him. I'm the one marked for life. What could I have done to stop it? The excuses we make for them are outrageous, but they're nothing compared with the ones we make for ourselves. And that concludes my review for My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. I know I got very personal there, but I had to. I mean, I could have done it otherwise. So, in conclusion, I do think it's a very good novel, even beyond what it gave me on a very personal level. I think it has the potential to foster a lot of discussions, at least I hope so. It touches upon delicate topics. At least I think they're delicate topics that deserve more open conversations in general. I think it's a good story too. I think there's good characterization. They're good, threads of reflection, etc. And well, at least there's something similar to my own lived experience out there in literary form. So that's a good thing, I think. Because I'm pretty certain there are other women out there, and maybe other men too, who are in my current position of the messy grey area. So if you're out there, I would recommend this book. Might help you think about things, or at least make you feel like you're not so alone with your feelings and memories. So that's it from me for now. This is going to be the last review in a while, because I'm currently going through all my Chronicles of Pen books, and that's going to last me at least until the end of May. In the meantime, I hope you will have a lovely day or evening. I hope you're all taking good care of yourselves, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye-bye.